You, Reza. Please go ahead.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for attending what is in fact a delayed book launch in reality for The Inevitable Caliphate. The Inevitable Caliphate was actually released in June 2013, and that itself was delayed from when it was supposed to be originally released, which was September 2012. And so having this event now 11 months afterwards, for those colleagues who are involved in academia, they know this is pretty much part of the course, doing everything in this kind of slow timetables. And before I begin my actual presentation, let me first of all mention that both my wife and my dad are in the audience, and I wouldn't be in the position here today actually. I wouldn't have been able to complete my studies, my research and so on, without their support and without my family's support. So I have to take this small opportunity just to thank them both. And also my thanks to Dr. Devji and Dr. Sayyid for agreeing to come along and to discuss the book. My own brief presentation is actually not going to be so much on the material within the book. People can read it, and also the discussants are going to mention more critical points. I'm going to talk more about the motivations behind it and its relevancy. And the book actually developed from a master's thesis which I wrote back in 2007, which was subsequently published in an academic journal, which was about the use of the Caliphate in the public discourse of Al-Qaeda's two leaders, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. And what drew me to that topic wasn't actually the discourse of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, because actually they don't talk much about the Caliphate. What drew me to that topic was the George W. Bush administration, because around that time, 2006, the use of the Caliphate as a term was being used by the W. Bush administration, and also on this side of the Atlantic by the Blair government, and also by various, you can call them neocon acolytes such as Michael Gove, raising this issue. And in 2006 alone, George Bush mentioned the Caliphate at a minimum of 15 times in his public speeches. That's in 2006 alone, 15 times in his public speeches. Including 4 times in one single speech. And that's quite an achievement for someone like George Bush. It's a 3-syllable foreign-sounding word. In the same administration, Bush's Vice President Dick Cheney warned that Al-Qaeda wanted to recreate the old Caliphate. Whilst before resigning, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld told Pentagon employees that the goal of extremists was to establish a Caliphate on the back of the destabilization of what he called moderate mainstream Muslim regimes. And what Rumsfeld meant by moderate mainstream Muslim regimes was, of course, people like Hosni Mubarak, people like Abdullah bin Ali Saleh, people like Zainuddin bin Ali, and others in the region. And so in actual fact, when I was doing the research, I found that these politicians in the West talked about the Caliphate in public far more often than either Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, or in fact the two of them put together, in terms of their public discourse. Between 1996 and 2006, we rarely find that either of the two of them talked about the Caliphate in their public statements. Maybe until after 9/11, and at that point it was often just used as a historical symbolism, as a kind of resource for motivation, to encourage people, for example, to participate in fight against the occupiers in Iraq, the seat of the Caliphate. In that way they would refer to it. So this was part of the motivation that, back in 2006, there was I felt there was a concerted atmosphere of almost political hysteria regarding the Caliphate, which had several reasons and purposes. It certainly became a useful phrase on both sides of the Atlantic in the discourse for some politicians in order to justify foreign policy excursions or excuses, and in a sense it was a more developed idea of their hate us for our freedoms, if you like. 2006 was also the year that I returned from Egypt to the UK. I had been in Egypt at that point from before both 7/7 and 9/11, and I returned to the country after being detained in Egypt for 4 years, which is a relatively short time to be detained in Egypt for political issues. I've been in prison
longer than Mubarak. He's got 3 years.
He's got 3 years. Okay, a relatively short time for anyone involved in Islamic political issues. Yeah. I've been involved in a case involving more than 20 others who were imprisoned on the basis of being members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And Hizb ut-Tahrir, for those people who are familiar with Islamic movements and Islamic groups, you recognize that this is the group which is most closely tied to the idea of the Caliphate, or synonymous, if you like, with the idea of re-establishing a Caliphate. And so, when I returned here in 2006, and began to hear all of this and began to settle back, and began to do a postgraduate degree in international relations, or history of international relations, I thought there was a real gap in understanding, not just among the media or the political establishment, but also within academia. And this gap was regarding Islam, politics, the Caliphate, the meaning of the Caliphate from a normative perspective and a contemporary perspective, contemporary understandings of it, and its relevancy and understanding among the different movements that call for it today. And I personally think that since 2006 until now, actually the need for these alternative kind of viewpoints is more acute. Need for an alternative kind of analysis and approaches is more acute than when I first returned. The manner in which Islam and politics is being taught today in several universities is often, very crude. It's often through security lens. It's often through the paradigm of, what's called today terrorism studies or counter-extremism studies, or these new names and new disciplines which have, come about recently. And there's so many categorizations which are, artificial and almost meaningless, simply pejorative terms. Previously there was fundamentalist, but in more recent times you have the idea of Islamist, or you have the idea of extremist. And this is not only with respect to this, this new and financially, if you like, attractive field of terrorism studies, but actually something which goes across even respected academia and established academia in the subject of political Islam. And I go into this in detail in the introduction to this book, actually. And just to make the small point, unfortunately, the reality is you have recognized authorities on the issue of Islam and politics who make statements that are actually completely incorrect from an understanding of normative Islamic law. One example which I'll give out, I mentioned inside the book itself. One particular author talks about how, for example, the Caliphate is not considered to be an obligation according to Islamic scholars, or it's an innovation to consider it to be an obligation. Obviously, anyone who studied Islamic law even a little bit knows that the opposite is true. The Caliphate is one of the few things which it's got a large agreement upon, which I'll come to in a minute. But the central point in my introduction, and the central point in my approach, which is the most important point, which I kind of developed from what Michael Sala mentions, is that much of the work on Islam and politics ultimately concerns itself with whether Islam is compatible or not with democracy, or in particular whether Islam is compatible or not with liberal democracy. And so on one side you have those who will argue that it isn't, people who are unsympathetic. They'll say Islam is incompatible with modernity and incompatible with democracy from a theological viewpoint, and so on and so forth. Then you have another side which is sympathetic. You can say they're sympathetic towards Islamic movements and Islamic groups, and they'll be the group, your Espositos and so on, who will say actually Islam is capable of being compatible with the modern world. It's capable, and what they mean compatible with liberal democracy as such. And so both of these groups ultimately make liberal democracy the reference point. Saleh sums it up by stating that the relationship between liberal democracy and political Islam is unidirectional. Political Islam either responds to liberal democratic norms by demonstrating their consistency with the Islamic heritage, or react to them as contrary to the Islamic heritage. So the use of democracy as some kind of standard that everything must be measured against hampers any real understanding of Islamic political theory in its own terms. And so it was this perceived shortcoming in the analysis of Islamic political movements and political theory in general that I wanted to try and address by presenting a different approach to the research, or at least to try and suggest alternative frameworks and viewpoints. And so therefore discussing the Caliphate and what it means to those who call for it seemed like an appropriate and relevant topic to deal with. this particular issue. At this point, it's best to state, what does the Caliphate mean in the context that we're talking about? I'll actually quote from a prophetic narration that normative Islamic scholarship would consider to be authentic. The majority of normative Islamic scholarship would be authentic. In which the Prophet is narrated to have said, there will be prophethood for as long as God wills it to be, then He will remove it when He wills. Then there will be Caliphate on the prophetic method, or Khilafah on the prophetic method, and it will be for as long as Allah wills. Then He will remove it when He wills. Then there will be biting kingship, and it will be removed. Then there will be oppressive kingship, it will be removed. And then finally there will be Caliphate or Khilafah upon the prophetic method. So Khilafah or Caliphate literally means succession in the Arabic language. And in this context of the narration, it means the succession to the Prophet. Not in terms of receiving revelation, because part of Islamic theology is that the Prophet is the last person to receive revelation, but in terms of responsibility to apply that revelation upon the society, or in other words, ruling people in accordance with Islamic law and interacting on the political stage on the basis of Sharia or Islamic law. There have been several books written about the Caliphate and its structure and so on, most famously by Muwardi in the 11th century, but he was by no means alone. And as a word, it's not actually that important in itself. You can use alternatives. Even though it's mentioned inside the prophetic narration, you can use the word imamate, for example. And the Shia would prefer to use that word because the Khilafah and the conflict between the Khilafah and Imamah, historically, there is a theological issue there. But in effect, it means the Islamic state, and it represents the ideal that the Muslim community or ummah should be led by a single leader who is responsible to implement the Sharia upon them. These 2 points, i.e. having a single leadership which rules according to Islam and is accountable to that, is practically agreed upon within normative Islamic scholarship historically, across the vast majority of the varying Islamic sects, ranging from the Mu'tazila through to the Shia. And this, it includes the 12 Shia. The difference on the obligation is not whether we should have a leader, a single leader who applies Islam or not. The difference is actually upon who that leader should be. So mainstream Islamic position is that it's by choice or by appointment, whereas the Shia state that it's by revelation. The leadership was chosen by God, if you like, and was given to the family of the Prophet Muhammad and has to come from the descendants of the family of the Prophet Muhammad. So, there is a large consensus upon the basis of what lies behind the meaning of the Caliphate. So while in the West the term evokes obviously negative imagery, just recently it was connected to Boko Haram. This whole thing with the kidnapping of 200 schoolgirls. One of the mainstream newspapers actually made a headline which stated Boko Haram, and their quest to establish the Caliphate, something along these kind of lines. And this discussion about what's happening in Nigeria is reduced to, they want to establish a Caliphate there, which it's another discussion. But throughout Islamic history, within Islamic scholarship, has been considered to be the ideal Islamic polity, with an agreed consensus in Islamic scholarship upon the obligation of its existence. Now, today, let me go to the second part, which is the issue of the relevancy today. It may seem strange that a polity that was abolished almost a century ago, because the final version of the Caliphate, which wasn't a very successful one by the time it was abolished, the Ottoman Caliphate, 1924 was abolished by Mustafa Kemal, and it was quite discredited at the time. So it seems strange that how come now, almost a century later, we're talking about it and it has a certain relevancy. And the reality is that the Middle East is in a period of crisis. And it's been in this period of crisis for some time. You have the abject failure of nation states. You have the abject failure of the post-colonial state in the region. You have the abject failure of other ideologies, whether secular nationalism or secular Arabism. So the story of the Middle East from World War I until today has been the struggle of coming to terms with or dealing with the post-Sykes-Picot setup. And this extends beyond the Middle East also, to other areas, Pakistan and so on and so forth, where there are a lot of grievances which, can be considered to be shared by many amongst Muslims. If Muslims, part of their identity, part of their ideology is that they're one community. Muslims in Pakistan often get very animated, for example, over the issue of Palestine. Yeah? So there's a lot of shared grievances and a lot of problems which haven't had any solutions. And with this perceived failure of the nation state, which is arguably a foreign and artificial construct, along with the failure of these ideologies that I've mentioned, which were once seen as liberation ideologies and actually had their heyday in the 1950s and 60s in the Middle East in particular, but were since discredited. The Caliphate is seen by some, as an alternative viable solution which is found within Islamic tradition, and it's come about again as a result of the rising religiosity in the region and beyond. And the idea of a unified Islamic polity could be considered to be very compelling and attractive, especially given the history of the region and the current state. And it also has popular currency today. I mentioned 2006 many times already, George Bush's commentary, me returning from Egypt, but also 2006 some research was carried out, amongst many other polls, from the University of Maryland, which showed that a majority of Muslims across 4 Central Muslim countries, including Egypt and Indonesia, believed that it was correct to have a single unified Islamic state, and believed or agreed with the goal of establishing the Sharia. The actual title of the poll was something like, how far did the Muslims agree with Al-Qaeda's goals? Because these were supposedly the goals of Al-Qaeda as expressed by George Bush. And this is why in one of the videos which Ayman Dawahiri released soon after these comments and continued discussion in Western media by George Bush and others, he talked about the accusation that Al-Qaeda is focused upon establishing a caliphate and said, well, it's natural. Muslims want the caliphate. And he said every Muslim wants the caliphate. This is what he said. And obviously that's stretching the point a little bit too far. You can't say every Muslim wants the caliphate necessarily. But the point stands. It has a central position in normative Islam and normative Islamic political theory. And that's the reason why every Islamic movement has practically addressed it in one way or another. Every political Islamic movement has addressed it in one way or another. And ultimately, this is what my book is about. This is the topic which my book is about. How this idea, the Caliphate, an idea which was seen as discredited in 1924, or even before 1924 to be honest, has become part of the political debate after its apparent absence for several decades. And, I'm discussing its subsequent re-emergence. And, raised many questions which I've tried to address in the book, which takes the reader through this kind of historical journey of the idea of the Caliphate from that period of the 1920s up until today. And I do believe, actually, that as a result of the uprisings across the region in the Middle East in 2011, that this book has become more relevant. There's an argument that it's not so relevant. I would, maybe go into it in the question and answers or the discussion after. I think this has become more relevant. There's a demand now to think about political alternatives in the Middle East. Discontent against local regimes is still very high and unlikely to dissipate. Syrian conflict is still ongoing. The dust is not going to settle from these events for at least, I would suggest, at least a decade. And it's clear that there's also substantial support for grassroots Islamic politics. And while this is often expressed in democratic terminology by some groups, the idea of a civil state based upon, which refers to Sharia as its basis, to be honest with you, the idea of democracy and freedom in the Middle East really has very little to do with the idea of marginalizing Islamic law or adopting secularism, as would be the case in Western perceptions of the word. Rather, it can often be reduced down to the demand to be able to choose your own leader rather than have them imposed upon you, and to have a consistent application of the rule of law, along with the freedom from dictatorships that do not necessarily or do not represent the people. And to many, this is what I believe the Caliphate ultimately represents. Rule of law, accountability, application of laws they believe in, a natural and authentic political solution from within their own tradition rather than imposed artificially from the outside. And I do believe that, it's a discussion that needs to be had. And I believe it's a discussion which is controversial even if we decoupled it from the issue of extremism. Because the very concept of a caliphate goes against the status quo. And it goes against the world order which has been, settled since post-World War I or post-World War II in particular. you know, and definitely when something goes against the status quo and goes against the interests of the great powers of the day, it's going to be controversial. There's going to be a lot of tension against it. You know, having a unified Islamic state, the concept of one, which would span several countries and would do away with several of these kind of city-states like Dubai and Qatar and whatever else, is you know, is a controversial issue. And especially at a time when in IR, for those people who are au fait with IR academia, practically everything just accepts the nation state as the de facto unit of polity, and almost treats it as an inevitable, you know, factor that's going to be there. Obviously, there's the discussion about globalization and so on and so forth. I had to teach this for 2 years actually, so and I know the debates quite well. But you know, there is a limited viewpoint by many students and many scholars when they come to it. But this is a big issue, not just for IR specialists, and I believe that it's also a discussion that deserves to be taken seriously. And I hope that, you know, the book helps to that, and I hope that today's event also will help add to that. Thank you very much.